Hi, this video is about the steps that you can take to writing an essay or a paragraph. And one of the things that I've said a lot, doesn't matter which of my classes that you have been in, one of the things that I say all the time is that the best thing that you can do when you have some kind of an assignment is to actually just get things down on paper so that you can begin to play with it and think more about what you're doing. Kind of like when you're doing a math problem, if you don't write anything down on paper, it's a lot harder to solve a problem and also a lot harder to figure out where you might need to do some extra work in answering a problem. And writing essays is the exact same way. You need to be able to get some things down on paper first. It can be hard, though, for us to begin writing. We have a lot of blocks to writing, and sometimes people find writing to be intimidating, or it makes them nervous, or for whatever reason. So I want to talk about some steps that you can go through to help you get started. One of the first things you want to do before you start writing is just to be really clear about what the assignment is. Depending on the kind of assignment that the teacher has given, the teacher might have a particular question that they want you to answer, or sometimes you get a series of 3 or 4 questions and you get to choose one. But you want to figure out what's the, what are you writing for? What's the purpose that you're writing for? And really, what's the assignment that you're writing? After that, there are a series of questions that really, if you think about these kinds of questions before you sit down to write, you're going to be in a lot better shape once you actually do begin writing the essay. Sometimes I watch students just start writing the essay right away, and they haven't really thought about what they're writing yet, and so they end up doing a lot of stabbing around in the dark. So one of the things you can do is look at the questions that I have here in the presentation. One being, what's the question? What's the real question that you're being asked? And how can I answer the question? There may be more than one answer to this question, but how can I answer the question that I'm being asked? And what's the best aha part of my answer? Or what's the most important part or the most significant part of the answer that I come up with? And as I'm thinking about that, I also want to think about what kind of support would be most effective. What are the kinds of things I can use in developing my paper or my idea that would provide the most effective support, that would be the strongest? I also want to make it interesting. So another question is, how can I make it interesting? And then as you're going through the work, another question that comes up is, where can I find more support? Sometimes we don't have enough support. We want to be able to figure out where we can find more. Now, after you look at those questions, you really think about those questions, actually answer those questions. And if you answer those questions in writing and you collect information about your answers, but you begin to answer those questions and you do it in writing, you'll be a lot closer to actually beginning to write the essay. So you can see that there's a lot of writing that goes on before you actually write the essay. And all of that writing, all that answering of those questions really kind of gets your pen going so that you're more ready to answer questions and begin writing the essay. Now, in addition to collecting information about your answers where you get some examples from different places, you also want to begin discovering your own answers. You don't want to always have to go outside and know that you can find an answer because this person says so and this person says so. But it's also part of that idea of your own thinking. And how are you collecting information? Once you collect different kinds of information, how are you putting it together in your own head? And that's why I have here, discover your own answers. Because you want to be more than just someone who repeats other people's arguments. You want to also be able to make your own individual arguments. After you've done that, you're really ready for steps 1 through 5. And these are really basic steps, and we're going to talk about them just briefly in this particular video. So step 1 is to settle on a thesis, to really write your thesis. The second is to explain the thesis. The third, to provide support. The fourth is to explain the support. and the fifth is to conclude or transition. Now you'll notice that there are 2 steps that have to do with explaining things. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but I want you to see how important it is to actually explain things. So step 1, you want to settle on a thesis, and there's a different video about thesis statements in particular. But really, the thesis is the most crucial part of the paper. It's what holds everything together. And it doesn't matter whether you're writing the thesis statement for a paragraph or you're writing it for an essay, it's the most important part because it keeps everything together. If it's in a paragraph, then it means that every sentence that's in that paragraph is going to support that thesis. And often in the paragraph, we call it the topic sentence. In a paragraph, in an essay, every paragraph that you write needs to support that thesis. And so really having the best possible thesis that you can have, that gets everything ready for the best possible paper that you can have because you have a strong thesis. So you want to be able to get that one down. Step 2 is to explain the thesis. Now in paragraphs, this is more necessary since the thesis statement or the topic sentence is usually the first sentence of the paragraph. And so once you write that and you're in the paragraph, you probably need to do a little bit more explaining about the thesis. In an essay, you don't necessarily have to do that because the thesis statement is part of the introduction, and it's usually the end of the introduction. So you have some explaining that happens before you actually mention the thesis. And so in both cases, you want to explain a little bit, but it changes where you explain. If it's in a paragraph, it's after the statement, and if it's in an essay introduction, it's before the thesis statement. And one of the things that the thesis statement does in terms of explaining the thesis is that it helps to make the relationships clearer or more clear, because especially in essays, we're looking at creating relationships between the thesis and the body paragraphs. In other words, the different kinds of support that we're going to have. And sometimes being able to explain the thesis in a clear way helps to make those relationships clear without spilling too many beans, to say. Now the third step is to provide support. And there's tons of different kinds of support that you can provide. You can add to this list, I'm sure, but you know, facts, statistics, details, descriptions, pictures, examples, reasons, quote, all kinds of things that you can use for support. And when you really start getting into writing as you go further into college, the more passionate that you feel about something, and the more that you want to be able to prove that your opinion is correct or that your analysis is correct, you really do stretch to find the best possible support that you can. Now it's possible that you can find tons and tons of support, but still again, you need to prioritize, unless you're writing a book, you need to prioritize how many of the kinds of support you're going to provide, and also try to figure out which ones are going to be the most significant. Now attached to step number 3 is step number 4, which has to do with explaining the support. So you can't just have an example of something or throw out a statistic and just leave it there. You have to have an explanation. You need to be able to explain how that piece of support supports the thesis or supports that particular body paragraph. But you can't just leave it kind of hanging there. And if you think of a fictional example, or if you're writing a character analysis, you can talk about a particular scene in a book, and 5 students might use that same scene to prove something different about a character. And so if you just throw the example out, the reader might not know what you're trying to say. And that's one of the reasons why you really want to make sure that you explain that support. I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of times students will be writing a paragraph and they have examples, but they don't say why the example or how the example supports the thesis. Now step 5 is different depending on whether you're writing a paragraph or an essay. If you're writing a paragraph, then the conclusion really does bring the paragraph to a conclusion. It kind of closes the circle. But if you're writing an essay, instead of a conclusion, what you're doing is you're kind of writing a combination, conclusion, and transition that goes from one paragraph into the next paragraph. If you think about, going to a movie and you see a trailer at a movie for a new movie, it's kind of like that. It's providing some kind of a preview, and what you're really doing is creating a path or a bridge that goes from one paragraph into the next paragraph, and so you have elements of both paragraphs kind of mixed up there, because since each of these paragraphs is in support of the thesis, right? Each of the paragraphs is in support of the thesis. That means that those two paragraphs are connected anyway. And what you're doing in that bridge, in that path, is connecting them more clearly. You can do this with words, you can do it with ideas, you can do it with transition words, which, by the way, are conjunctive adverbs. And so that's some of the grammar that we study. And so conjunctive adverbs help you to make these kind of conjunctions as well. Now, one of the questions comes up in terms of an essay. If you're not writing a 5-paragraph essay, and most writing is not a 5-paragraph essay. We study the 5-paragraph essay just as a way of creating a habit to have a certain kind of organization. But most essays are not necessarily 5-paragraph essays. So the question becomes, when do you need a new paragraph? When does it become time to introduce a new paragraph? And really, it's if you have a new idea. Sometimes you're writing along, and then later on when you're reading it, you realize, oh, this long paragraph I have is actually 2 ideas. Is there a place where I can separate them? And so if you have a new idea or a new point about something, you might want to begin a new paragraph. Also, if you're having contrasting information or contrasting ideas, when you're doing a kind of a comparison, that is sometimes a good place to also have a paragraph break. Also, if you're somebody who writes really long paragraphs, and I've known some people who write really long paragraphs, sometimes you got to give the reader a break, and the reader needs a break because the paragraph marking allows the reader to kind of take a little bit of a break before they kind of an intellectual break or an emotional break from their reading, to let them kind of absorb the information that they have been reading. So sometimes you want to have a paragraph break just because you want to give the reader a break. And introductions and conclusions are always alone. They never share. An introduction always has its own paragraph, and a conclusion always has its own paragraph. But this idea of when do you need a new paragraph, really think about your own writing as you look back through some of the things that you've written, whether it's for this class or another class. Especially if you're in any of my reading classes, you might look at your reaction papers and think about where are really good places for you to create paragraph breaks. Now, everybody's got a job to do. Every sentence has a job in every paragraph. So what you want to be able to do for a paragraph is to say, here's a sentence, or, well, I guess I'm speaking in contrast with the slide, but every sentence in every paragraph has a job. That's exactly right. And if you're writing a paragraph, every sentence in that paragraph has a job. Is it supporting something? Is it explaining something? Is it concluding something? And paragraphs are the same way in an essay. Every single paragraph that you write has a specific purpose. And when you're reading, the same thing is true. When you're reading, whether it's a fiction book, or you're reading nonfiction, or you're reading a magazine article, if you're reading something that has been written by a professional writer, it has also been edited by a professional editor. And what that means is that anything that's extra, anything that's unnecessary has been cut out. It means that every single sentence that you see in an article, whether it's in a book or it's in a magazine or a newspaper, is necessary. And part of what you want to be able to do is to identify what's the function? So if you're reading a book like Fast Food Nation, every paragraph in that book has a specific purpose. And every section of that book has a specific purpose. And every chapter of that book has a specific purpose. And your job as a reader is to figure out what's the purpose. What is it that you're supposed to learn from that particular section of the book? And as a writer, you have the same responsibility to look at every paragraph that you write and say, what's the purpose of this paragraph? Is the job to introduce something? Is it the job to conclude something? Is it doing development? Is it doing explanation? What's the purpose of this paragraph? And if you're looking at your own writing and you don't know what the purpose is of a paragraph, that's a problem. And you need to go back and either cut the paragraph or you need to rewrite the paragraph so that you can identify what its function is.